Round three. Hello, everyone. This is Jocelyn Lugo coming at you live from my grandmother's spare room to talk to you today about our political film of the week, Frost/Nixon. And first off, before I even say anything else, I just want to say that this is probably one of my favorite movies we've done so far. Not even gonna lie. This beats out Street Fight, even though Cory Booker was my main love. I could go on about it, but because we have to get into the presentation, let's just say I didn't even care that it was 2 hours long. So, on to the summary. So, the movie opens with an overview of the Watergate scandal, of course, since that's essentially what this movie is about. You can hear the infamous tape recordings of Nixon in his office, and we're shown a series of news reports from the 70s, which are all talking about the scandal and, the cover-up afterwards and Nixon's possible involvement. And after that opening, we're introduced to our main character, David Frost. Oh my god, what a love. He's a British television show host who is shown currently filming for his program that he has in Australia. And his character, it's kind of, it isn't made to be one that's taken seriously. He's kind of shown to be this, cheeky, charismatic guy, and he's, pretty much just, a silly daytime TV talk show host that's not really, taken very seriously. So that's why when he tells his company that he wants to interview, the Nixon, they all basically tell him, that he's crazy and it's just not gonna happen. But David being David, he extends the offer to Nixon's advisor, Swifty Lazar, anyway. So that's the end of that scene, and then we cut and move on to the next scene, where we see Nixon in California in his vacation home with his advisor, who actually tells him that the interview would be a good idea, because at first Nixon's just, not about it. But Lazar knows about Frost's reputation, about being, kind of lighthearted with his questions and, not very reputable, I guess. So he knows that he's just this TV, persona, and that he basically tells Nixon, that he'd be getting $600,000 to basically wipe the floor with Nixon and make himself look better in the process, because that's how much that he's offering just to do this, little interview. So of course, Nixon ends up agreeing, because then otherwise we wouldn't have a movie. But then, after bringing up the proposal to the companies that could advertise the interview, David kind of realizes that no one's really biting because of his reputation. So he, struggles to come up with the money to fund the interviews that he promised Nixon. And in the meantime, he hires Zelnick and Reston. So Zelnick and Reston, they're two investigators meant to help Frost come up with hard-hitting questions for Nixon, and do some research on the Watergate scandal as a whole, and all that fun stuff. And so they come up with 4 days of filming, and they're going to film for 90 minutes each, and each day is going to be a different topic. So they choose foreign policy, domestic policy, Nixon's personal life, and they save, of course they save the Watergate scandal for last. Unfortunately, the first 3 days of filming don't just go bad. They're terrible. They go terribly for Frost, and Nixon's totally prepared and won't even let Frost get a word in. He just sits there and goes on and makes himself essentially look better. So it's at this point, after these 3 interviews go terribly, this is where the film kind of hits its darkest point. Frost's team, first off, they're furious with him for letting Nixon practically exonerate himself. They kind of made it, in the beginning, they wanted to, nail home the fact that they wanted to get Nixon on doing all these awful things, and, that they didn't really trust Frost, and blah, blah, blah. So now everyone's just mad. Frost's Australian TV show gets canceled while they're in the middle of trying to do these interviews. And the funding, it's just not there. So, everything's not going great. But then a few days later, before the final interview, Frost gets a phone call in his hotel room, and on the other line is a very drunk Nixon, and Nixon goes on, I guess what can only be described as a rant, basically, about how he and Frost are essentially the same. He says a lot about how they both came from nothing, and made something of themselves, and now the world is basically mad at them for all that success. And he also, towards the end of his little rant, he mentions that the last interview will make one of them a hero and just totally destroy the other. And then he just kind of hangs up. So there was that. And then so poor David, he's sitting there in his hotel room just totally stunned. But then he has a breakthrough, and so in the middle of the night he calls Reston, and the two of them go to the Washington Library, and they look through all these records, and then they prepare for the last interview, which I think is about 3 or 4 days out. Um, and then honestly, when it's time for the Watergate interview, I'm not even gonna lie, I was pretty excited. So the tables totally turned, and because Frost was so prepared, they totally catch Nixon off guard. He just blows the Watergate case wide open when he reads out Nixon a transcript of his past self, basically talking about hush money for the robbers and where they're gonna get it from. And he's just left completely cornered, doesn't know what to do. So realizing that one, first off, he's totally out of options, and two, that he's actually pretty tired of denying everything. Nixon ends up apologizing to the American people. He acknowledges his role in all of the wrongdoing and that he let everyone down, and basically that he made the whole entire country suffer for 2 years just, because of his abuse of power. But it doesn't really end there, of course. The final scene takes place a little into the future after the final interview in California, where Nixon and Frost speak for the last time before Frost leaves to go back. So Frost is now widely respected. What a hero. And their interviews are basically famous. Everyone's watched them, millions of people watch them, and everyone loves it. So he asks Nixon about the phone call on that night and why he called him. And then Nixon actually said, what phone call? So he just doesn't remember anything. But instead of, talking about it and bringing it up, David just kind of lets him go, and he's like, all right, thank you for the interview, do well, blah, blah, blah. And then that's pretty much it. The interview was a massive success, well, for David at least, and Nixon is kind of left where he was before, if anything, just feeling a little bit better now that he got all that stuff off of his chest. And yeah, that's pretty much Frost/Nixon, which was, yeah, my favorite movie so far.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Thomas here. Just going to give you all a little bit of background information on our two main characters, David Frost and Richard Nixon. So, first we have David Frost, who was an English television host, media personality, journalist, and writer. Frost became known for his television interviews with senior political figures, including 8 British prime ministers and 7 American presidents. Richard Nixon, on the other hand, was the 37th president of the United States, and he served from 1969 up until 1974. By late 1973, the Watergate scandal had escalated, which had costed Nixon much of his political support. So on August 4th, 1974, he resigned before he was faced with impeachment and removal from office. So to this day, Nixon is the only president to have ever resigned from the office. And he eventually was issued a controversial pardon by his successor, Gerald Ford, which prevented him from being tried for his crimes against the United States. And in 1977, which is when this film takes place, Frost interviewed former U.S. President over the course of 5 90-minute broadcasts. And major television networks actually turned his interview program down, so Frost had to risk his career by funding it primarily with his own $600,000. And this interview was extremely important historically because this was the first time that the American people would get to finally possibly hear Richard Nixon open up about what happened during Watergate, his involvement with it, and hopefully to see an apology or some form of explanation for, the crimes that he had committed and everything that had kind of happened. So I'm going to pass this off to Zach, but hope you all enjoy. Have a great rest of your week.
All right, so I decided to compare Frost Nixon and All the President's Men because they both pertain to the same subject of Nixon, and they contrast nicely with the time frame and the goals set by the main characters. So to start, for Frost Nixon, was the big question of the week. We had pursuit of truth or pursuit of money. So a lot of people thought that this was just Frost and his investigative team going after like a cash cow of having Nixon on tape. But in reality, Frost and his colleagues were very dead set on getting Nixon to crumble and tell the truth on the whole Watergate scandal. Zelnick and Reston Jr., the entire time they were part of the team, were very dead set on getting an admission that the United States public was very adamant about getting. Is this redemption or a confession? Frost and his team were really worried due to the time frame of only 3 tapings that the film could make a martyr out of Nixon because it would only show him bullying Frost into a submission with just endless talking about his like the accolades of his presidency. But what they really wanted to do was show his guilt to the American public through the films. For the credentials of the media coverage, Frost was never an investigative journalist. He was just a TV host in the UK, and in Australia he was always doing like celebrities or just funny gags on television. So for him to take on a investigative show with the former president of the United States, Richard Nixon, after the Watergate scandal was something to really behold because it's never been seen before. The crew was as low budget as they come. They struggled for investors the entire time, compared to Woodward and Bernstein, who had the Washington Post to kind of back them. It made it a lot easier for Woodward and Bernstein to work in like an organized setting. And was the end goal achieved? In the end, Nixon did falter, and he painfully admitted his failure as a president, which was monumental because the United States had been waiting for an admission from Nixon for years after his resignation, but they never got it. But they finally did with Frost. One thing, though, is he never really did pay for his crimes. We kind of just see Nixon fall into the background, I guess, because he would never, as he said, have a political career again. Like his political life was over, and thus ends Richard Nixon's career. For All the President's Men, Woodward and Bernstein working for the Post, they were very low-name journalists that didn't have a lot of experience under their belt, with multiple attacks that were made on the paper due to Woodward and Bernstein digging around with government employees and all that. It threatened their jobs multiple times, and the funding of the Post became kind of scary for the heads of the paper itself. Access to information was definitely very hard to grasp onto, unlike in Frost, where everything was on the table. People had been writing books about Nixon and investigating further, whereas Woodward and Bernstein were literally going door to door, knocking on people's doors and just trying to get all the information they could, and meeting Deep Throat in the car garage was probably not the most easy thing to get information out of. So they had to depend on outside sources the whole time. That was definitely more of a struggle for them instead of, unlike Frost. These two journalists had way more experience in investigative journalism than I think Frost did, and I think that showed in the beginning of the movie Frost Nixon, because he kind of didn't take it seriously because he'd never been faced with like a political opponent that is like used to talking, used to debating with people. At the end, he finally did his homework, and with Reston and Zelnick, he put together quite the compelling last scene that would eventually get Nixon to crumble. Um, Woodward and Bernstein would eventually see their victory come to fruition with Nixon's resignation. So I guess that goal was achieved, but they never really got like that concrete win because it would take another year for Nixon to resign. And although the paper did bring a lot more like public eyes to the whole Nixon Watergate scandal, I don't think that it personally had as monumental effects as when Frost got Nixon to crumble on his show, but I do think it was monumental nonetheless, and that is why we compared the both of these.
Hi, I'm Tyler Vassell. I'm from Allison Park, PA, and we're going to be looking at the themes in Frost Nixon on this slide. For me, the first thing that popped up was the theme of the underdog. At the time, Frost was definitely the big underdog going into this interview. Before the interview, he was really only a talk show host in Australia, not taken very seriously. He was kind of just seen as a comedian that wasn't really going to go anywhere. But Frost, on the other hand, had dreams of being much bigger than he was. He used to have two former shows, and he really wanted to gain that back as a way to be popular and famous. And he saw this drama around Nixon leaving office as a way to try to gain some of that fame back. So he came up with the idea of interviewing Nixon. And when he pitched the idea to all these TV networks and some colleagues of his, they kind of didn't take him seriously at all. They all just kind of, the network producers, especially when he tried to pitch them the idea to air it, all these producers were saying, Foss, you're just not the guy for this. You're more of a talk show guy. This isn't your forte. Nixon's gonna destroy you, and that you're just not gonna look good for you. So it doesn't look good for us as a network either. So we're not gonna be able to do this for you. And that really hurt Frost going into this interview. And before this interview started, Nixon and his team obviously looked into Frost. And he kind of saw the same thing, that Frost was just a talk show guy in Australia, and his show was just more of a comedic kind of thing, nothing hard-hitting. So Nixon didn't really take him seriously. So going into this interview, Frost definitely was the underdog, wasn't really being taken seriously by anyone. And it really showed in his demeanor the first few days of the interviews, where he was just really hesitant and scared to cut off Nixon or to bring up any hard-hitting things because so many people told him he couldn't do it. But we see later on, obviously, the last day, he finally finds a confidence and basically tricks Nixon into confessing, basically. This kind of goes into what the second theme is. It's the theme of redemption. For Frost, kind of mentioned it earlier in the underdog idea, that he wanted to see some redemption in his career and be kind of taken more seriously because that's what he believed he could be, and he wanted to use this interview to get that back. For Nixon, he definitely needed some redemption. Obviously, he faced so much controversy leaving office, which forced him to resign, and this was a little bit after that time, so he was still fresh in the public's mind, and he knew that if he portrayed himself as this president who just got caught up in a really bad situation and did the best he could in a hard situation, that maybe the American people would forgive him and not see him as this hated president and kind of sympathize with him. And that's what Nixon and his team wanted to portray in these interviews. They kind of told Nixon to give out these very relatable stories, go on long explanations about the questions, and kind of just do filler answers where he didn't really answer Frost's question and didn't make sure they couldn't dive into anything deep. And Frost and his team both knew this about Nixon, that they were worried that he was going to try to get the American people to sympathize with him. And Frost's team wanted to try to get Frost to push hard on Nixon, but Frost wouldn't do that right away. It wasn't until the last day where he's finally starting to press Nixon on the hard issues. So up until that last day is when Nixon was looking really good. Frost and his teammates were really kind of down and out, especially the two investigators. They really, really were on the brink of quitting and giving up on it because they knew that Nixon was winning, basically, and was going to come out looking at the good guy in this whole situation, which is not what they wanted. But finally, that last day of the interviews about Watergate is when Nixon slipped up, and Frost was able to trick Nixon into basically confessing to what he did. So obviously Nixon didn't get the redemption he needed or wanted, but Frost was able to get that redemption, and he became a much more popular figure after this interview. He got back his shows. He started being more into movies. So for him, this movie worked out. This interview worked out for him. And for Nixon, on the other hand, it did not. Another theme of this film that popped up was this theme of persistence. During this whole time, Foss and his team really had to work hard to get Nixon to say what they wanted, basically. They were kind of going into this interview trying to find a way where they would get Nixon to admit what they wanted, but without threatening Nixon and making him run away and shut down the interview. So they had to be persistent and try to come up with creative ways to get Nixon to answer the questions they need. And luckily, Frost, at the end, during the fourth interview, was finally able to get that confession basically out of Nixon. But it took a lot of hard work and digging. Frost and his team had to work really hard before the interviews to find any new credible information where they could use that against Nixon and back him into a corner. Luckily, they were able to find a source of information that Nixon did not know about, which really helped them in their pursuit of getting Nixon to confess, basically. And then that kind of goes into the next theme of never giving up. The Frost team was kind of down and was kind of behind from the very start of this whole process. Frost obviously has never done anything like this before. And then the other people that made up his team were kind of new to this whole thing too. They were investigators, and then one was Frost's friend from the network, who again didn't really have any experience in this as well. So they kind of had to work hard and not give up from the very beginning. And then once they got to the interviews, they faced some of the same issues where they had to really couldn't give up. They knew this was a once in a lifetime thing, and they had to work hard to make sure that they got Nixon in the corner so he would mess up. This really was helpful. Their persistence and the idea of never giving up are two big themes that really popped up in this movie, and they are very closely related with how Foss and his team went about conducting these interviews.